Hello, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we will be exploring a subject of quiet but profound significance in the daily lives of millions. Imagine the sensation of falling. Not a dramatic, cinematic plummet, but the brief, weightless moment of a childhood misstep. A hand slips from a metal bar, a foot misses a rung. For a fleeting instant, there is only air. Then, contact. What you land on is perhaps the single most engineered, debated, and standardized feature of the modern American playground. It is a surface born not of whimsy, but of data, litigation, and countless committee meetings. Its texture, its depth, and its very composition are the results of a quiet, 4-decade-long revolution in how we perceive childhood risk. To truly understand the soft ground beneath a child's feet today, we must first journey back to a time when the ground was anything but soft, and the consequences of a simple fall were taken for granted. In the year 1960, the concept of a municipal playground in the United States was a well-established, if not a particularly well-scrutinized, feature of the urban and suburban landscape. These were spaces of perceived freedom, areas carved out for the explicit purpose of children's play. The equipment that populated these spaces was often monumental in its construction. Towering steel slides that shimmered under the summer sun, heavy-gauge chain swings that could carry a child to impressive heights, and robust, multi-person seesaws that demanded a certain level of cooperative negotiation. Yet, beneath these imposing structures, the ground was often an afterthought, a surface chosen for its durability, its low cost, and its ease of maintenance, rather than for any property related to safety. The most common materials were asphalt and concrete, particularly in dense urban environments. These surfaces were ideal from a municipal management perspective. They were permanent, they did not require replenishment, they were easy to clean, and they resisted the erosive effects of weather and foot traffic. A playground built on an asphalt pad was a playground that would require minimal upkeep for decades. In other areas, particularly in more suburban or rural parks, the surface might be hard-packed earth. This was simply the native soil, compacted over years by the relentless patter of feet, until it achieved a hardness nearly equivalent to that of stone. In some cases, a thin layer of grass might be present, but this was often quickly worn away in the high-traffic areas, especially at the exits of slides and beneath the arcs of swings, exposing the hard, unforgiving dirt below. The idea of a fall zone, a designated and prepared area around a piece of equipment, did not exist in the common lexicon of park planners or the public. The ground was simply the ground. It was a uniform, undifferentiated plane upon which the apparatus of play was placed. A fall from the top of a slide onto asphalt was not seen as a failure of design, but rather as an unfortunate yet accepted consequence of childhood activity. The prevailing ethos was one of personal responsibility, even for a child. The scrape, the bruise, the occasional broken bone, these were considered part of the tapestry of growing up, teachable moments in the development of caution and physical competence. This perspective was not born of malice or neglect, but rather from a different cultural understanding of risk and childhood. The post-war era was one of immense confidence and a belief in ruggedness. The world of adult work was often physical and dangerous, and the world of play was seen, in some ways, as a training ground. Furthermore, the systematic collection of injury data related to specific consumer products was still in its infancy. While hospitals certainly treated the fractures, concussions, and lacerations that resulted from playground accidents, there was no centralized mechanism for aggregating this information, for identifying patterns, or for tracing these injuries back to specific design flaws in equipment or environment. An accident was an isolated, anecdotal event. It was a story told within a family or a neighborhood, not a data point contributing to a national statistic. The link between the height of a climbing structure and the severity of an injury from a fall onto concrete was intuitively understood on a case-by-case basis, but it had not yet been quantified, analyzed, and translated into preventative public policy. The ground remained hard, because the data had not yet made a compelling case for it to be soft. The 1960s, however, marked the beginning of a slow but inexorable shift in this paradigm. This was not initially driven by playgrounds themselves, but by a broader societal awakening to issues of consumer protection and product safety. The work of figures like Ralph Nader, particularly his 1965 book Unsafe at Any Speed, which targeted the automobile industry, began to popularize the idea that manufacturers and, by extension, public entities had a responsibility to design products and environments that anticipated and mitigated the risk of human error. This burgeoning consumer movement fostered a new climate of inquiry. If cars could be designed to be safer in a crash, could not other products, other environments, be designed to be safer in their use? This line of questioning began to percolate through various sectors of American life. Within the realm of playgrounds, the first stirrings of change were academic and philosophical. Landscape architects and child development experts began to look critically at the traditional American playground model. They compared the static, prescriptive nature of steel and asphalt lots with the adventure playgrounds that had gained popularity in Europe after World War II. These European models, pioneered by figures like Carl Theodor Sørensen in Denmark, often featured loose parts, wood, tires, ropes, and tools that allowed children to build and modify their own play environments. While the primary focus of the adventure playground movement was on creative and developmental play, a secondary, and perhaps unintentional, consequence was the nature of the ground itself. These were often messy, unfinished spaces, with surfaces of sand, dirt, and wood scraps. They were inherently softer and more varied than a paved lot. While not explicitly designed for fall safety in the way we understand it today, they demonstrated that a play space did not need to be hard and immutable. This philosophical shift, however, remained largely within academic and design circles. For the average municipal parks department in the 1960s, the practical considerations of budget, durability, and vandalism deterrence far outweighed these more abstract concepts. Still, some early small-scale efforts to soften the ground did begin to appear. Sand was perhaps the most common initial choice. A sandbox was already a familiar playground element, so the idea of extending that sandy area to be underneath a set of swings or a small slide was a logical, if not yet scientific, step. Parks departments might install a wooden or concrete curb and simply fill the contained area with a few inches of sand. Grass was also seen as a desirable surface, and efforts were made to maintain a healthy turf in play areas. The limitations of these early materials, however, quickly became apparent. Sand, especially in shallow depths, offered minimal real protection from a fall of any significant height. It was also prone to contamination by animals, debris, and moisture, leading to compaction and unsanitary conditions. It was easily displaced, creating thin spots under high-traffic areas, and it was abrasive, finding its way into clothing, hair, and eyes. Grass, for its part, was simply not durable enough to withstand the concentrated foot traffic of a playground. The very areas where a fall was most likely to occur, at the base of a slide, under a swing, or beneath a climbing frame, were the same areas where the grass would be worn away most quickly, exposing the hard-packed earth beneath. These early attempts were gestures toward safety, but they lacked the rigorous, data-driven foundation that would be necessary to effect widespread, standardized change. The ground was getting nominally softer in a few places, but the fundamental problem of impact absorption had not yet been systematically addressed. The dawn of the 1970s marked a critical turning point. The societal momentum of the consumer rights movement culminated in the passage of the Consumer Product Safety Act in 1972, which established the United States Consumer Product Safety Commission, or CPSC. This new federal agency was given a broad mandate to protect the public against unreasonable risks of injuries associated with consumer products. While many people associated the CPSC with household appliances or children's toys, its purview was wide, and playgrounds, both public and private, fell squarely within it. For the first time, there was a federal body specifically tasked with investigating the safety of these environments. The most powerful tool wielded by the newly formed CPSC was data. The agency established the National Electronic Injury Surveillance System, known as NEISS. This was a statistically representative sample of hospitals across the country equipped with teletype machines that could transmit daily reports on product-related injuries to a central CPSC database in Washington, D.C. A hospital admissions clerk, when processing a patient in the emergency room, would record the patient's age, the nature of the injury, and the product or activity associated with it. For the first time, a child arriving at a hospital in Oregon with a broken arm from a fall off a merry-go-round and another child in Florida with a head injury from a fall off a slide were no longer just two isolated incidents. They were two data points in a rapidly growing national picture. The NIES data allowed the CPSC to quantify the problem. They could identify which types of playground equipment were associated with the most frequent and most severe injuries. They could see the demographic breakdown of these injuries, confirming that young children were the most vulnerable population. And, most importantly for our story, they could categorize injuries by their cause. Overwhelmingly, the data pointed to one primary cause of serious debilitating playground injuries: falls. Specifically, falls from equipment onto the surface below. The data was unequivocal. While other hazards existed, sharp edges, pinch points, head entrapment, the sheer volume and severity of fall-related injuries dwarfed all other categories. The hard ground, once an accepted and unexamined part of the playground, was now identified by statistical evidence as the principal hazard. Armed with this data, the CPSC began its work. The initial focus in the mid-1970s was on the equipment itself. The Commission undertook studies and issued safety alerts regarding specific hazards like the potential for head and neck entrapment in openings of a certain dimension, or the dangers of heavy, rigid animal-shaped swings. But the surface issue was always present in their research. In 1976, the National Bureau of Standards, working with the CPSC, published a report that began to seriously investigate the concept of impact-attenuating surfaces. This research involved laboratory testing. Scientists created apparatuses to drop instrumented headforms, metal spheres or hemispheres equipped with accelerometers, onto various types of surfaces from different heights. The goal was to measure the forces transmitted to the headform upon impact. This was the birth of the scientific approach to playground surfacing. Researchers could now generate objective, repeatable data that compared the performance of asphalt, concrete, packed earth, sand, pea gravel, and early synthetic materials. The results confirmed what intuition and the injury data already suggested. Hard surfaces like concrete and asphalt produce dangerously high impact forces, even from relatively low fall heights. These forces were more than capable of causing life-threatening head injuries like skull fractures and brain hemorrhages. Loose fill materials, however, showed significant promise. The data demonstrated that a sufficient depth of materials like sand or pea gravel could dramatically reduce the impact forces, slowing the deceleration of the headform and cushioning the blow. The key variables the researchers found were the type of material, its depth, and its state of compaction. For example, 12 inches of loose, dry sand performed significantly better than 6 inches of wet, compacted sand. This research established the foundational principle that would guide all future standards: the critical height. This is the maximum fall height from which a life-threatening head injury would not be expected to occur onto a given surface. A surface's performance was no longer a matter of opinion. It could be assigned a numerical value, a critical height rating. A playground surface with a critical height rating of 8 feet was considered safe for equipment with a maximum potential fall height of 8 feet or less. This concept was a revolution. It directly linked the design of the equipment above to the specific material composition of the ground below. The two were no longer separate entities, but were two parts of a single safety system. The quiet, unexamined ground was finally being given a voice that spoke in the language of physics and data. As the 1970s drew to a close, the CPSC had established the what, that falls onto hard surfaces were the primary problem, and the why, that impact-absorbing surfaces could mitigate this problem. The next decade would be dedicated to the how to translate this knowledge into practical, actionable guidance for the thousands of park districts, schools, and daycare centers across the country. The 1980s was the decade of the guideline. It was a period of translating laboratory science into field-ready recommendations. The culmination of the CPSC's initial wave of research was the first publication in 1981 of the Handbook for Public Playground Safety. This document was not law. It was not a federally mandated regulation. The CPSC presented it as a set of voluntary guidelines, a best practices manual for playground operators, but its influence cannot be overstated. It was the first comprehensive, nationally distributed document that addressed playground safety in a systematic way, and it placed enormous emphasis on the issue of surfacing. The 1981 Handbook was a landmark publication. It synthesized years of injury data analysis and material science research into a digestible format. For the first time, a local parks and recreation director had a single source to consult that explained concepts like use zones. The handbook defined a use zone, sometimes called a fall zone, as the area under and around a piece of equipment where a child might be expected to land after a fall. It recommended that this zone be filled with a suitable impact attenuating material and that it be kept clear of other equipment or obstacles. The handbook specified the minimum dimensions for these use zones, recommending, for example, that the zone should extend at least 6 feet in all directions from the perimeter of a stationary piece of equipment. For swings, the recommendation was even more specific, requiring the zone to extend twice the height of the pivot point, both in front of and behind the swings. This was a radical departure from the playgrounds of the past, where a slide, a set of monkey bars, and a bench could be crowded together on a single asphalt slab. The guidelines effectively demanded more space, fundamentally altering the calculus of playground layout and design. But the most influential section of the handbook was its detailed discussion of surfacing materials. It laid out the CPSC's recommendations based on the best available science of the day. It explicitly recommended against the use of hard surfaces like asphalt, concrete, and hard-packed dirt under any equipment from which a fall might occur. In their place, it provided a hierarchy of acceptable loose-fill materials, along with recommended minimum depths. The handbook stated that sand, for example, could provide adequate protection, but it needed to be maintained at a depth of at least 12 inches to be effective for falls from higher equipment. It noted the problems of compaction, especially when wet, and the need for regular raking and replenishment. Another material highlighted was pea gravel. This consisted of small, rounded river stones, typically 3/8 of an inch in diameter. Pea gravel offered some advantages over sand. It did not compact as easily, and it provided better drainage. However, it also had drawbacks. The stones could be thrown or swallowed by very young children, and the material was prone to significant displacement, creating bare spots directly under swings or at slide exits. To be effective, the handbook recommended a minimum depth of 12 inches for pea gravel as well. The handbook also introduced a material that would become a mainstay of playgrounds for the next 2 decades: wood chips. The CPSC's research found that wood chips offered excellent impact attenuation. The guidelines distinguished between different types of wood products. Basic wood chips, perhaps from local tree trimming services, were acceptable if properly processed to remove splinters and contaminants. A more refined product, sometimes called wood mulch, was also recommended. Again, a minimum depth of 12 inches was recommended for protecting against falls from typical equipment heights. The handbook meticulously detailed the pros and cons of each of these materials. It discussed maintenance burdens, drainage characteristics, and potential ancillary hazards like splinters or choking. The message was clear: choosing a safe surface was not a one-time decision. It required an ongoing commitment to maintenance. A playground operator could no longer simply install a surface and walk away. They now had a responsibility, outlined in a federal document, to measure depths, to rake and level the material, and to top it off as it became compacted or displaced. The publication and widespread distribution of the CPSC handbook in the early 1980s had a profound, albeit slow-moving, effect. Because the guidelines were voluntary, there was no immediate nationwide mandate to rip out asphalt and install wood chips. Change happened incrementally. As new parks were built or old ones were renovated, a parks director, now aware of the CPSC recommendations, would be hard-pressed to justify installing a new playground on a concrete pad. The handbook became the new standard of care, even if it wasn't legally binding in a statutory sense. Insurance companies who provided liability coverage for municipalities also took note. They began to see the CPSC handbook as a useful tool for risk assessment. A park district that followed the CPSC guidelines was seen as a lower liability risk and might receive more favorable insurance rates. Conversely, a district that ignored the guidelines, especially after a serious injury occurred, could be seen as negligent. The handbook began to take on a quasi-legal authority. In personal injury lawsuits filed on behalf of children injured on playgrounds, the CPSC handbook was frequently introduced by plaintiffs' attorneys as the industry-accepted standard of care. A failure to follow its recommendations could be presented to a jury as evidence of negligence on the part of the park operator. This threat of litigation became a powerful motivator for municipalities to upgrade their playgrounds, particularly the surfaces beneath them. The quiet revolution was no longer just about data and science. It was now also about liability and finance. The soft ground was becoming a legal necessity. Alongside the CPSC's work, another crucial organization was beginning to play a role: the American Society for Testing and Materials, now known as ASTM International. The ASTM is a non-profit, non-governmental organization that develops and publishes voluntary consensus technical standards for a vast range of materials, products, systems, and services. Unlike the CPSC, which is a government agency, the ASTM standards are developed by committees of volunteers, which include producers, consumers, academics, and other stakeholders. In the 1980s, a new ASTM subcommittee was formed to address the issue of playground equipment and surfacing. Their work ran parallel to the CPSC's, but it was aimed at creating a more detailed, technical, and testable set of standards that manufacturers and installers could use. This work was painstaking and methodical. It involved countless meetings, debates, and rounds of balloting among committee members. The goal was to create a standard that was both effective in preventing injury and practical for the industry to implement. One of the most important standards to emerge from this process was ASTM F1292, the standard specification for impact attenuation of surfacing materials within the use zone of playground equipment. First published in the late 1980s and refined in the years following, this standard was a game changer. It took the laboratory-based research of the 1970s and codified it into a precise, repeatable testing procedure that could be performed in a laboratory or, crucially, in the field on an actual installed playground surface. ASTM F1292 described the testing apparatus in exacting detail. It specified the use of an instrumented head form, typically a metal hemisphere, of a specific weight and dimension. It detailed the type of accelerometer to be placed inside the head form and the electronic equipment needed to record the data from a drop test. The standard then laid out the two key performance criteria that a surface had to meet: Gmax and the head injury criterion, or HAC. Gmax refers to the maximum acceleration or shock experienced by the head form upon impact. It is a measure of the peak force of the impact. The ASTM committee, drawing on biomechanical research from the automotive and aerospace industries, set the maximum allowable Gmax at 200. This meant that for a surface to be considered compliant, a drop test from the designated fall height of the equipment could not produce a peak deceleration of more than 200 times the force of gravity. Any higher value was considered to represent an unacceptably high risk of injury. The second criterion, HEC, was a more complex and nuanced measurement. The head injury criterion is a value calculated from the entire acceleration versus time profile of the impact event. It takes into account not only the peak force of the impact, the Gmax, but also its duration. A very high force for a very short time might be less injurious than a slightly lower force that is sustained for a longer period. The HEC formula, also borrowed from automotive safety research, integrates these factors into a single score. The ASTM F1292 standard set the maximum allowable HEC score at 1000. A score of 1000 was determined through extensive research to correlate with about a 1 in 16 chance of a life-threatening head injury. Therefore, a compliant surface had to produce a HEC score of less than 1000 when tested from the equipment's fall height. The establishment of ASTM F1292 was a monumental step in the standardization of playground surfaces. It moved the conversation beyond simply recommending 12 inches of wood chips. It created a performance-based standard. Now, any material, whether it was sand, gravel, wood fiber, rubber, or some new innovation, could be objectively tested and certified for a specific critical height. A manufacturer could send their product to a lab, have it tested according to the F1292 procedure, and receive a report stating that their product, when installed at a certain depth, met the standard for an 8-foot fall height, or a 10-foot fall height, and so on. This allowed for apples-to-apples comparisons between different products and spurred innovation in the playground surfacing industry. It also provided a powerful tool for quality control. A school district or parks department could now specify in a purchase order that their new playground surface must be ASTM F1292 compliant for a fall height of 8 feet, and could even hire a third-party inspector to conduct on-site testing after installation to verify compliance. The ground was no longer just soft, it was now certifiably, quantifiably safe to a specific engineered standard. The 1990s saw the maturation and convergence of these trends. The CPSC handbook and the ASTM standards became increasingly intertwined. The CPSC updated its handbook in 1991, and again throughout the decade, and in these later editions, it began to explicitly reference the ASTM standards as the technical basis for its recommendations. The two documents became companion pieces. The CPSC handbook provided the overall safety philosophy and general guidelines in an accessible format, while the ASTM standards provided the detailed technical specifications for manufacturers and installers. In 1993, the ASTM published another landmark standard, F487, the Standard Consumer Safety Performance Specification for Playground Equipment for Public Use. This comprehensive standard covered all aspects of playground equipment design, from entrapment and entanglement hazards to the structural integrity of the equipment. Crucially, it incorporated the requirements for safe surfacing by direct reference to ASTM F1292. It mandated that every piece of equipment with a designated play surface above a certain height must have a surrounding use zone filled with a surface that complied with F1292 up to the full height of that equipment. Although the ASTM standards, like the CPSC guidelines, were technically voluntary, F1487 quickly became the universally accepted standard of care in the United States. Its adoption was driven by the legal system and the insurance industry. In the event of a playground injury lawsuit, a court would almost certainly consider ASTM F1487 to be the benchmark against which the playground's safety should be judged. A manufacturer who sold equipment that did not meet the standard, or a park that installed and maintained a playground that was not in compliance, would be at a severe legal disadvantage. This reality effectively made the voluntary standard a mandatory one for any public-facing organization. This period of codification and legal reinforcement coincided with significant advancements in the materials themselves. While sand, pea gravel, and basic wood chips were still in use, the 1990s saw the rise of more sophisticated, specifically engineered surfacing systems. One of the most significant of these was engineered wood fiber, or EWF. EWF was not just any wood chip. It was a product manufactured specifically for use as a playground surface. It was typically made from virgin wood, processed in a mill to create fibrous, interlocking particles of a controlled size and shape, with the sharp edges and splinters removed. This uniformity and interlocking nature made EWF less prone to displacement and compaction than traditional wood chips. It provided a more consistent and reliable level of impact attenuation. Manufacturers could have their EWF product tested in a lab and certify that, for instance, a 9-inch non-compacted depth would provide an F1292 compliant surface for falls up to 10 feet. EWF quickly became one of the most popular and cost-effective choices for public playgrounds. It combined the natural aesthetic and good drainage of a wood product with the testable, reliable performance demanded by the new standards. The 1990s also saw the emergence and growth of synthetic unitary surfaces, most notably poured-in-place rubber and rubber tiles. These systems represented a significant departure from loose fill materials. Poured-in-place, or PIP, rubber surfaces are installed on site. The process typically involves laying down a base layer, or buffing layer, made of shredded recycled tire rubber mixed with a polyurethane binder. The thickness of this base layer is what determines the surface's critical height rating. A thicker layer provides more cushioning and is suitable for taller equipment. On top of this base layer, a thinner, wear course is applied. This top layer is made of finer rubber granules, often a synthetic rubber called EPDM, which can be colored. This allows for the creation of intricate designs, patterns, and play markings directly into the surface itself. Rubber tiles offered a similar final product, but used a different installation method. These were prefabricated square or interlocking tiles of a specific thickness, manufactured and tested in a factory setting. They were then transported to the site and laid out over a hard subbase, like concrete or asphalt, and adhered in place. Both poured-in-place systems and rubber tiles offered several key advantages over loose-fill materials. Their impact attenuation was consistent across the entire surface. There were no worries about displacement creating thin, unsafe spots. They were also much easier to maintain. They did not need to be raked or replenished, only cleaned. Furthermore, they did not conceal foreign objects like broken glass or other hazards the way loose-fill materials could. However, these unitary surfaces also had disadvantages. Their primary drawback was cost. They were significantly more expensive to install than loose-fill materials like EWF. They also required a stable, prepared subbase, adding to the installation expense. Over time, they could harden due to UV exposure from the sun, reducing their impact-absorbing qualities. They could also be damaged by vandalism, and repairs could be difficult to blend in seamlessly. Despite these issues, the consistent, low maintenance, and testable performance of unitary rubber surfaces made them an increasingly popular choice, particularly for high-use urban parks and for facilities where maintenance resources were limited. The final, and perhaps most transformative, influence on playground surfacing in this period came from outside the world of playground safety altogether. The passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, in 1990 set in motion a process that would fundamentally reshape the public landscape, including playgrounds. The ADA is a wide-ranging civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life. While the initial focus of the ADA was on things like building entrances, restrooms, and public transportation, its principles were eventually extended to cover recreational facilities. In the late 1990s, the Access Board, the federal agency responsible for developing accessibility guidelines, began to formulate specific rules for newly constructed and altered play areas. The central question was, how do you make a playground accessible to a child who uses a wheelchair or other mobility device? This question had profound implications for playground surfacing. A child in a wheelchair cannot navigate through 12 inches of loose sand or wood fiber. The very materials that had been chosen to provide fall protection were now identified as significant barriers to access. This created a fundamental design tension. A surface had to be soft enough to cushion a fall, yet firm and stable enough to allow for the passage of a wheelchair. To address this, a new ASTM standard was created, F1951, the standard specification for determination of accessibility of surface systems under and around playground equipment. This standard established a test method for measuring the firmness and stability of a surface. The test involved using a specialized device to measure the work required to propel a wheelchair across the surface. A surface that passed the F1951 test was deemed to be an accessible surface. The ADA Accessibility Guidelines, which began to be incorporated into playground planning toward the very end of our period, around the year 2000, required that at least one accessible route be provided from the park entrance to the playground, and then connecting the various accessible play components within the playground. This route had to be made of a material that complied with ASTM F1951. This requirement strongly favored the use of unitary surfaces like poured-in-place rubber and rubber tiles, as they could easily meet both the F1292 impact attenuation standard and the F1951 accessibility standard. Loose-fill materials faced a greater challenge. While some specially prepared engineered wood fiber products could be installed and compacted in a way that allowed them to pass the accessibility test, it required a very high level of installation quality and diligent maintenance to prevent the surface from becoming too loose over time. The ADA effectively accelerated the trend toward unitary surfaces, at least for the accessible pathways within a playground. Many playground designs in the late 1990s and into the new millennium adopted a hybrid approach, using poured rubber for the accessible routes connecting the equipment, and more cost-effective engineered wood fiber within the fall zones of the equipment itself. Thus, by the year 2000, the ground beneath an American municipal playground was a completely transformed entity from what it had been in 1960. It was no longer a passive, forgotten element. It was an active safety system, a highly engineered product born from a 40-year convergence of social advocacy, data collection, scientific research, legal precedent, and civil rights legislation. The journey began with the simple, intuitive observation that falling on asphalt hurts. This was then quantified by the CPSC's NEAS data, which proved that these falls were a massive public health issue. This data spurred laboratory research that established the principles of impact attenuation and critical height. These scientific principles were then translated into practical, accessible recommendations in the CPSC's Handbook for Public Playground Safety. These recommendations were further refined and codified into detailed, technical, and testable standards by the ASTM, most notably F1292 for impact safety and F487 for overall playground design. The legal and insurance industries then adopted these voluntary standards as the de facto mandatory standard of care, providing a powerful financial and legal incentive for municipalities to comply. This demand, in turn, fueled innovation in the private sector, leading to the development of superior materials like engineered wood fiber and unitary rubber surfaces. And finally, the civil rights imperatives of the Americans with Disabilities Act added another layer of performance requirements, demanding that these safe surfaces also be accessible surfaces. The hard, immutable, and unforgiving ground of 1960 had been replaced by a surface that was a product of meticulous thought and compromise. It was a surface designed to absorb the kinetic energy of a falling child, to reduce the forces of impact below the threshold of life-threatening injury. Its very depth and composition were a physical manifestation of a society's evolving understanding of its duty of care to its youngest members. The scrapes and bruises of childhood still occurred, of course, but the catastrophic, life-altering injuries from a simple fall had been dramatically reduced. The story of the standardization of playground surface materials is not one of dramatic events or famous figures. It is a story of incremental progress, of countless committee meetings, of the slow and steady accumulation of data, and of the quiet, persistent effort to make the ground a little softer, a little safer, and a little more forgiving. It is a testament to the idea that sometimes the most profound changes are the ones that happen right beneath our feet, almost without us noticing, until one day we look down and realize that the entire landscape has been reshaped.